126972.
Roger that, tower.
We have them on radar, sir. They'll be landing in a few moments.
Excellent. See that Counselor Swan is sent directly to me.
2004 saw the release of two of the biggest FPS games of all time, and truly two of the most anticipated. I'm talking about Half-Life 2 and Doom 3, both long-awaited follow-ups which took the series in an entirely new direction. In Doom's case, it tried to bring the series into a new age with the brand spanking new id Tech 4 engine and a much greater focus on a tighter, refined single-player mode. Did they succeed? Yes and no. So once again, the story revolves around the UAC facility opening a portal to hell and unleashing all manner of demonic assholes.
This is bad. I can't hold these levels.
You take on the role of the Doom guy and have to fight your way through a series of similar looking levels as you find a way to stop the invasion. On the whole, the campaign is pretty damn long, and on the first playthrough, it might take you anywhere from 8 to 15 hours to complete. This time around, there's also a set of secondary characters who we're given little to no backstory on, and ultimately their motivations revolve around politics involving the UAC Corporation.
I'm afraid you'll get nothing more until my report is filed with the board. I will need full access, Dr. Petruga, Delta included.
The main antagonist is an evil scientist called Dr. Petruga, who seems intent on opening the Hell Portal, though for what reason we're not entirely sure. Other short cinematics top and tail certain levels, and each enemy type also has a brief introduction the first time you encounter them. Most of these are pretty fun to watch, even if they are a little bit ham-fisted.
Okay, Plan B.
Most people won't be playing Doom 3 for its storyline. The majority of players are people who spend a copious amount of time on the original, like myself. On that note, old school Doom fans will see some familiar weapons make a return, like the shotgun, chainsaw, and rocket launcher. New additions include a machine gun, which basically just serves as a weaker version of the chain gun, and the Soul Cube, a supernatural item acquired about 2/3 into the game that gives health back to the player when enemies are killed with it. Likewise, the enemies themselves are largely just updated versions of enemies from the original game. Imps, Pinky Demons, and Lost Souls. The new additions are forgettable for the most part, and most, if not all of them, just generally run towards you in a straightforward manner and beat the living shit out of you with a basic melee attack. Really, the only new enemy worth mentioning are the Trites. These are spider-looking things with upside-down human faces that creep towards you menacingly and leap forward when you're in range. First time I encountered these bastards, I think I broke out into a cold sweat, and even now, they generally unnerve the absolute piss out of me. Much like classic Doom, dealing with all these enemies is a matter of knowing their attack patterns and learning how to minimize the damage taken. Doom 3 was the first game I ever purposely upgraded my rig for, and I can remember spending a monumental fee on an Nvidia 5800 at the time, which turned out to be one of the worst GPUs I've ever owned. But it was worth it. Doom 3 looked amazing, even if it did have some serious optimization issues upon release. Seeing dynamic shadows move across the walls and watching the way lights interacted with objects in the environment was truly a sight to behold. And the way dynamic lighting was used throughout the campaign was masterful. In fact, all the games released around that time had some pretty shit-hot lighting. And even looking at it now, ignoring the horrible textures, it's still a fantastically lit game. Imp fireballs now cast dynamic shadows as they get launched across a room, and there's even a few brilliantly scripted areas where you move through a pitch black area with nothing but a single solitary light source. It's the type of thing you just don't see in gaming anymore. Aside from sharing the same name and enemy types, however, Doom 3 is a lot different to its 90s counterpart. You will still collect health kits and armor pickups, though the combat is now a lot slower and much more toned down than before. It's not about taking on dozens of bad guys, often the most you'll have to deal with is 4 or 5 at a time. Movement speed and shooting takes a bit of a backseat, and the game focuses a lot more on exploration and giving the player something of a thick horror-based atmosphere. You still move level to level, though it's less about hunting for keycards and more about turning power systems back on, sending out transmissions, that kind of thing. Basically, you're sent in to do all the housekeeping.
Satellite connection established.
There's also times when you run into former UAC employees who are more than happy to give out an unrequited recap on prior events.
I don't know what's going on here. I don't understand why none of the systems are responding.
And on some levels you have to solve some basic puzzles here and there to mix things up a bit. That's not to say you won't be doing your fair share of shooting, but there are sections in between where the game switches gears, either by interacting with NPCs or scaring the living crap out of you using jump scares and all manner of spooky sounds and imagery. Generally, the pacing between each level is spot on, though the first few areas of the game tend to drag on a bit, and even after the 3 or 4 hour mark, you're still only acquiring some of the weapons and still being introduced to new enemy types. It can feel a little bit slow off the mark, but on the plus side, the last quarter of the game is fantastic in terms of pacing, and serves as a great ending to the campaign. You really do have to play Doom 3 on hard mode, as it's way too forgiving otherwise. On hard mode, you can only take a handful of projectiles or bullets before you buy the farm, and it gives the game a much needed sense of tension and urgency. However, it's when you play the game on hard mode that all of its faults seem much more prominent. The biggest issue with the gameplay and level design is that it frequently revolves around ambushing the player and trapping them in confined areas or dead ends. This often happens as you pick up an item and is accompanied by a few demons spawning in, dimming the lights so you can't see jack shit and often blocking your only means of escape. Now, this kind of thing is tolerable initially, but it does get pretty old pretty damn quick, and it will really just annoy people more than anything else. Almost every time this sort of thing happens, it puts you in a really disadvantaged position. Some of these are set up in a way that it's impossible to avoid taking damage. The most common example being one where you open a door or turn a corner, only to have an imp leap at you instantly and take off a large chunk of your health. They literally reuse this gimmick a few dozen times throughout the campaign, and it's just fucking irritating. Another common trick is the way they'll spawn a monster behind you that always manages to get you while you're too busy dealing with things from the front. Now that's just cheap. Fighting the Zombified Humans is pretty crappy as well. These are the former Mars security team that have been turned against you, and during a gunfight, these guys hit dead on the mark every single time, even with a shotgun from the other side of a room. The machine and chain gunners are the worst, as they can pretty much fire at you constantly until they have to reload, throwing your crosshair all over the place with each direct hit. These enemies also seem to have a faster firing rate than the player as well, which is total bullshit. And it's not even that they're smart or anything like that. In fact, their entire strategy consists of either standing in one place and shooting, or running around, then stopping and shooting. But this kind of thing can be really tricky because they're coded in a way that means they will always hit you, and on higher difficulties this can pose a real problem, especially when there's a bunch of them at once. Sometimes they can be staggered, but most often they'll just fire right on back at you, totally uninterrupted by the stream of machine gun bullets that you're sending right to their forehead. And the shooting really has lots of little flaws like this that will become more noticeable the more you play the game. I mean, even the little things like how you have to wait for a reload animation to finish before you can swap a weapon out. I mean, it doesn't sound like much, but just think about it. You got a couple of guys rushing towards you and you can't swap to another weapon because you're stuck in an inexplicably unskippable animation. On hard mode, that can be the difference between life and death, literally. And these are the kind of things that really prevent Doom 3 from being a classic in the same way that Doom 1 was. These are minor irritations to be sure, but they are irritating, and most of them take control away from the player and cause you to become prey to the shortcomings with the game's mechanics. I would still ultimately recommend Doom 3 to people looking for a game that has a good mix of horror and shooting, but it definitely shows its age in a few key areas. And as a result, it's not quite a masterpiece in the same way its predecessor was. But for the most part, the single-player campaign shows a lot of polish and attention to detail, with the last few areas of the game being really enjoyable and full of action. And it's a great example of a bygone era of shooting games, where the single-player took absolute focus above everything else.
Rise, rise, quoth Lord Yalopan. There is no death for you.
There's numerous visual mods to get the game up and running in one resolutions, as well as a re-release called the BFG Edition, which is total garbage. Mostly because it messes around with a lot of the fundamentals of the gameplay, so your best bet is to grab a copy of the original for dirt cheap and go from there. Newer gamers might find its design and gameplay a little bit prehistoric, but it still will offer up a challenging and lengthy campaign for people who can appreciate what it was going for.